On December 24, 1914, soldiers of both the British and the German army decided to hold a ceasefire and be human for one day, exchanging gifts and walking amongst their enemy. Thus, the Christmas Truce of 1914 began, and the war could be over.
And our story begins here, during Christmas time, where all is quiet on the Western Front.
Small armistices were happening almost daily. Each side simply became accustomed to the use of trench warfare. Each army ate their meals at the same time, patrols simply looked at each other with no conflict between, just a stare down. Troops even often shouted across the opposite side with their voices echoing across no man's land. But mainly besides when conflict would occur and either side would go over the top, the weather was the antagonist. Living in the trenches was horrible. When too much rain would collapse into the muddy sides of the trenches, the walls would collapse and crush soldiers, cementing them into their tombs. Another thing to add to this fact is that for most of these soldiers, this would be their first Christmas away from family. And so, to counter their emotions, the commanders issued Christmas gifts to be given to the men. Each German soldier received a cigar box from Kaiser Wilhelm II. The royal family also sent gifts. They sent Princess Mary boxes to the Indian and British troops. They were filled with chocolate, sweets, cigars, and tobacco. Eventually, that Christmas Eve, Mother Nature brought a true gift. The rain stopped and the snow began to fall, almost in a Hallmark-like fashion. Gunfire began to slow down, and in some regions, none were heard at all. Germans were cheered by the weather, so they started to place small Christmas trees along their trenches on the parapets. At first, from a distance, the British thought it was a means of attack, but then they heard the very faint but recognizable Stille Nacht, or Silent Night, being sung by the troops. So the British started singing Silent Night, each side going back and forth until eventually their voices harmonized into a beautiful collage of cultured tones. After the song, the men started to shout Christmas greetings to the other side. Then a few stepped out to talk, and soon the entire British line was doing the same. The two sides shook hands with each other, getting a really good look at their supposed enemy, this time in conversation and not perhaps an over-the-top charge. Officers agreed to cease hostility the next day. In other sectors, it was Germans attempting to communicate with English. Tomorrow, if you no shoot, we no shoot.
Soon the two sides were smoking and drinking together, thanks to the Germans tempting them out of their trenches to fraternize.
Not every region wanted pursuing peace among men. One British regiment had machine gun fire drown out the greetings to make the men retreat back to their trenches, and kill the unarmed Germans who were still on no man's land. This truce mainly did happen between British and German units. The French and Belgians, who at this time were held under military occupation by the German Empire, were less tolerant, and few were willing to seize, but used the time to mainly bury the dead.
And almost in a dreamlike fashion, all slept quiet on the Christmas front, with no surprise artillery tonight.
The morning sun rises across the snowy no man's land. The sky is clearer than it has been in weeks. As the British awoke, they found the German Saxons walking around no man's land. In normal wartime fashion, this would be suicide, but they admired the trust they had in them to not shoot. In daylight, each side noticed the bodies, and they agreed to bury the dead and grieve side by side as human beings should. That shared experience of just grieving together made the men realize that they are not so far apart. Exchanged more gifts such as beef for uniform buttons, chocolate cake for barrels of beer, and they even exchanged caps. They understood each other, recognizing both sleep under the same rain, live in the same field for months at a time, and each sick of the war. As it was believed, the fighting would only last until Christmas. Both sides were also puzzled, for the British were confused how the German Empire was saying they were fighting for freedom and God was on their side, when the British in return said that it was impossible, for they were fighting for freedom and God was on their side. They started to realize the inner machinations of war, and how God fights for no side on war. Up and down the lines, men brought out footballs to start games with. Supposedly, as the story goes, a match played between the British and the Germans claimed to have won 3-2. Even the Germans in the 133rd Royal Saxon Regiment played a game against the Scottish troops. It was truly an event to witness, your enemy in war not just being an opposite team member in a game of football. On the German side, one squadron of Bavarians asked if they could meet the British. Their corporal snapped back at them and stated, "Such things should not happen in wartime," and then saying that they have no sense of German honor. Corporal Hitler was very odd in that way. At dusk, the officers had thought everything was enough. The generals were already furious and demanded discipline action to be taken immediately. Some men returned back to the trenches with no warnings, and others were forced back by flares. A German artilleryman who spoke good English left his new British friends saying, "Today we have peace. Tomorrow, you fight for your country, I fight for mine. Good luck." By Christmas Eve of 1915, some sectors tried to recreate the Christmas truce again by singing carols and shouting Christmas greetings. Unfortunately, in most sectors, British officers ordered a 24-hour artillery barrage. Men who tried to form a truce were court-martialed. Machine guns drowned out the sound of beautiful German carols. On a small-scale event, the spirit of the Christmas truce would be replicated in 1915. The French and the Germans caught themselves in a spontaneous ceasefire when heavy rain forced them out of their trenches. Frenchmen and Germans looked at each other, smiling and greeting to one another. Soon, they were sharing tobacco and coffee. One day, a German stood atop a mound and began a speech. The Germans seemed very excited at what was happening since he was speaking in their language, but the French soon realized what was happening when the Saxon grabbed his rifle and slammed it on a tree stump, breaking it in two.
The spirit of the Christmas truce was almost whimsical, as it had a semi-mythical status as a glimmer of human connection in the midst of a bloody war. Unfortunately for most of the soldiers who participated in the 1914 truce had already gone through mustard gas, Zeppelins were bombing London, and unfortunately most of them didn't even make it to the next Christmas.
In December 1914, a letter to a German newspaper read, "Yesterday there was a fierce and terrible onslaught of Christmas packages into our trenches. No man was spared. In the confusion, one soldier suffered a salami impaled straight into his stomach. Another had raisins from an exploding pastry fly directly into his eyes. A third had a misfortune of a bottle of cognac fly into his mouth."
The letters of World War I bring a true insight into how the war was fought and what kinds of experiences these soldiers endured. One young private, Henry Williamson, wrote about the Christmas truce several times throughout his entire life. One of the first letters he ever written about the truce was on December 26, 1914, which reads,
"Dear Mother, I am writing from the trenches. It is 11 o'clock in the morning. In my mouth is a pipe presented by Princess Mary. In the pipe is tobacco. Of course, you say. But wait, in the pipe is German tobacco. Aha, you say, from a prisoner, or found in a captured trench? Oh dear, no. From a German soldier, yes, a live German soldier, from his own trench. Yesterday, the British and Germans met and shook hands in the ground between the trenches, exchanged souvenirs and shook hands. Yes, all day Christmas Day, and as I write, marvelous, isn't it?"
From the German perspective, it was the same marvel of sheer amazement. One German corporal, Joseph Wenzel, wrote,
"That I had believed to be madness several hours ago, I could see now with my own eyes. Bavarians and English, until then the greatest of enemies, shook hands, talked and exchanged items. More and more joined, and the entire line greeted each other."
There are countless letters just like these that show the absolute awe that these soldiers had seeing their enemy shaking hands with their fellow soldier. And as I said, it was believed that this war would end by Christmas. Unfortunately, that is not the truth.
There are only two ways the war would have ended by winter of 1914. First, one side wins. The Schlieffen Plan, ordered by the Germans to have a surprise attack on France, originally failed, but the war could end in an alternate timeline where it wasn't deemed unrealistic and it actually works. with the Germans pushing back the Belgians, French, and even British all the way back to Paris, and just like the Franco-Prussian War, humiliates France and takes their capital once again. Of course, this would lead to unsettled disputes, probably leading to another war which would end up the same way it did in the original timeline of World War I. And the second way is just an actual Christmas miracle, in a timeline where men really do refuse to fight, and ultimately a mass event of thousands of soldiers quitting to rejoice in their new lives with their new foreign friends, resulting in a general mutiny, almost similar to the Russians on the Eastern Front with their revolution, but instead it would be a protest on a pointless war. It would have been impossible for a Christmas truce to truly end the conflict, as this was still 1914 Europe, where nationalism, patriotism, and politics influenced everyone just as much as it does today. In order to truly have the war end early is to have the German Empire lose faith in their cause, forgetting the romanticizing of war and propaganda to the Kaiser, and the hell-like conditions of trench warfare would have to be swayed upon the restless German army. Since the idea of constantly moving to occupy was on the Germans' mind, a stalemate is devastating for their morale.
Now, losing morale like this as well is very unrealistic. Almost all the factions in the war were pretty self-delusional, having constant morale that one final over-the-top could push through the enemy lines and break through it.
Another possible solution is where Germany provides peace deals amongst their enemies. In our real timeline, peace deals were made but never officially done, because simply of the ignorance of the generals who would never listen to their diplomats and only to themselves. They could never imagine giving an inch to the enemy, and that any concession was failure. World War I was just really an explosion of a powder keg named Europe, ready to be detonated. So many centuries of conflicts building up to this war, and if it were to end just so abruptly, just from July 28, 1914 to December of 1914, that would be a huge disappointment on all fronts, almost leading to a scenario of the War of 1812 where there is no clear winner or loser and it's all just based on perspective. This event is a true sign of humanity on the brink of the most depressing and dark war. Some regard the Christmas truce of 1914 to be one of the most impactful events in history.
And I can agree. It's so wonderful to know that even in wartime, you can somehow be connected to the enemy, fighting man to man, heart to heart, and human being to human being. And yes, I know it's past Christmas time for this video to be uploaded, but what do I know? I'm just a piece of toast on the internet.